I'd like to make a few announcements before we start. One is that the two people who are coming here from Bilin and Hebron will be here tomorrow night at 1:45 Grinnell at 7 p.m. These are probably the best opportunity we'll have all semester to talk to people who are doing very active nonviolence in an extremely tense situation. But unfortunately, they won't be able to have that special meeting with us that we were planning. There might be something available at Bolt Hall at noon tomorrow, but I haven't gotten any details about it yet. If I do, I will just send out a CourseWeb announcement to everybody. Also, I want to say we got a very long, very moving email this morning from someone in Somalia who's been watching the webcast of this course. So, hi, C. I hope you're watching this one. This gives me a very good feeling that what we're doing here is going out, being used all over the world in very violent situations. I think we should feel very good about that. I found out yesterday, this is my 5th straight day of teaching nonviolence classes all over the state, that there's an interesting project going on in Germany this summer. For those of you who are interested, speak a little German. I think we see you, Amy. I'm going to leave these folders right here. So what I would like to try to do today is, believe it or not, wrap up the discussion of LARSAC, which has been going on for almost as long as the campaign did. There are a couple of interesting issues that it will flag for us, and try to do all of that in a short order and move quickly to the question of anti-militarist organizations. We've been talking about movements and uprisings and demonstrations and things of that kind, and we're going to talk today about institution building. This is sort of a new mode for us. And we've talked about the fact that there are institutions that do various kinds of helpful work, but we're going to get into a major institution which, in my humble opinion, and you know I am very humble and very opinionated, in my humble opinion could, if done right in course of time, actually be that alternative that we're looking for to the war system. But let me postpone that and get back to LARSAC. I left you in suspense. The conclusion, the movement was coming to a climax. The farmers had handed over, this is in 1978, handed in 1,000 military papers refusing conscription, and they handed them into the UN, which was a major sort of escalation. And then in 1980, farmers met with people from Poglof, and I'm sorry, I forgot to check where that is. I think it was a German city. I'll double check that, where people were resisting a nuclear plant, and 100,000 people assembled there. So for those of you who took the first semester, your antennae are going up and saying, we may have a problem here. Imagine if the people who are sitting under the oak trees right here on our campus were to win, get major concessions from the university, bring the administration to its knees. I don't think that's going to happen. But let's say they did that, and at that moment they decided, okay, now that we're on a roll, we got in a position of advantage, we want to talk to you about student fees. We want to see a 50% reduction in student fees across the board by next year, or we go back to the trees. Okay, what would that be called, and what would be the issues that are raised by this? Zoe? Yeah. Yeah, it's called no fresh issue, and it's sort of a principle that it just applies in general to gentlemanly ways of adjusting differences, having conflicts. And that is, when you're in a position of advantage, you do not want to press to an issue that you haven't even been discussing. And why is this important? Why is this not just a polite strategic maneuver? What's at stake here? Matt?
Because you try to add on so many things to a movement.
Yeah.
The original things you're going for.
Yeah. I mean, what you're saying is true, that if you keep on changing and adding, you could lose focus on the original issue and it could fail. But I would still consider that kind of strategic. I'm looking for a theoretical reason why this is a bad thing to do. After all, your cause is just, their cause is unjust. Why shouldn't you ram home everything by means of, Shannon? Right. Right. It changes the model of the frame, I guess is the word we would use today. It reframes the whole interaction as a power struggle instead of as a discussion among equals. So it's like you are escalating. You're moving from stage 1 to stage 2. Okay, so that's the background now for our question. And the question is, when the farmers moved, remember the original issue was that land was going to be taken over by the military to expand a military base. Farmers were going to be run off. No more Roquefort cheese in Berkeley. That was the original issue. Now they're expressing solidarity with people in another country who are working on another issue, namely anti-nuclearism. And there was incidentally a big deal. There were 100,000 people who gathered at that assembly. And to let you in on a little more that's going to happen, this is going to build out into an entire anti-globalist, anti-globalist movement very soon. So we know that there's such a thing as, quote, no fresh issue that you want to observe or you change the dialogue. Here's my question. Do you think these guys were violating no fresh issue? Because it's a rather specific framework. And it doesn't mean that once you've got an issue, you cling to that issue for the rest of time. Because that way, we have people saving whales over here and people being against nuclear plants over there. No connections would ever be built. So we have to develop a sense of whether this particular action, and more generally when an action violates the no fresh issue requirement and when it doesn't. So, Marcella, it looked like you didn't think it was a fresh issue. Why?
So it's a nuclear power plant?
Yeah. Well, I don't actually know whether it was a nuclear power plant or a nuclear missile installation. That'd be an interesting thing to know, yeah.
Nuclear missile installation, the issue is militarization.
Yeah.
Escalation of militarization.
Uh-huh.
Okay.
Okay.
It wouldn't be a fresh issue because farmers are talking about the escalation of militarism in their country.
Yeah.
They're going to in solidarity with other groups.
Yeah. So I agree with you, as you probably suspected from the beginning. And what is happening here is not dredging up a fresh issue that wasn't on the table, but rather getting down to the underlying issue and realizing what connections it has. So I think if the students who come down out of the oak trees and, let's say, just to completely fantasize here, let's say that the chancellor is forced to kneel in the mud outside the oak trees all night long, and we get to talk to him in the morning. I'm not even in favor of this, much less am I predicting it. Then we talk to him in the morning, we start talking about student fees and stuff. That really would be a fresh issue because you've got a position of advantage, which is really not clearly the case yet with the farmers in LARSAC. And it really is kind of unrelated, unless you want to say that all evil is evil and all good is good. That's probably true in a sense, but not in a useful sense. It would be blurring the distinction. So that's the two things, that the issue is unconnected and that you would be using the leverage of advantage to press home something you hadn't considered before. Okay? But in this case, neither of those applies. I think what's happening is you say, okay, we don't want this camp in our backyard. the next thing you discover is the whole French government was behind putting that camp in your backyard. And so you're really getting down to the bedrock of the issue. And that's going to take one step further now. Very soon, let me just wrap up quickly what actually happened. In July and September of that year, 1980, they concentrated on constructive program. That is, they went and did repairs and improvements on farms in Larzac, on the Larzac Plateau. And then some months later, on the 5th of June, 1981, President François Mitterrand was elected. And as you know, he was a socialist. I don't know what a socialist is anymore in modern Europe, but he was a socialist, whatever that is. And he had made a campaign promise, which was, dès l'instant, from the moment when I am president of this country, I'm going to withdraw the military base in Larzac. And Le Monde, which is sort of the New York Times of France, much better writing, less advertising, but still somewhat the same problems. They announced that President Mitterrand would fulfill his campaign promise to revoke the expansion, and the campaign came to a successful conclusion. Leading to the question of whether, in fact, the campaign helped to get Mitterrand elected, which I think it probably did, but it's hard to know exactly to what extent. So that was the campaign. It was 9 years. It worked, quote unquote, beautifully. It followed the law of suffering. It followed the law of progression. I think we've just decided that it did not violate no fresh issue, and if we decided it, then it probably is the truth. And it became really big by keeping the focus on a single issue which had deeper and deeper repercussions. So not only did it work, quote unquote, but it also worked in the sense that it did good work and going on into the future. For one thing, I don't know how many of you know the name of José Bové. He's a, anybody know who this person is? Hmm? He is a farmer, and he's a southern French sheep farmer, so he comes right from this community. And yeah, he was involved in labor unions, but he's famous for something else. Yes, Sashi. He's against GMOs, genetically modified organisms. Well, he's not against the organisms. He's against the idea of genetically modifying them. And he's also famous for, he led some protests, actually, is absolutely correct. And in one of those protests, he decided to torch a McDonald's that was being built in southern France. So this is getting us into a gray area. Is property destruction part of nonviolence? We discussed it last semester and came to the conclusion that it's not all that sweet because it's not very persuasive, it's coercive. You know, what you want to do is wait till whoever has the McDonald's franchise sees the light and understands that they should turn it into a free clinic instead. But you're taking away their option, their choice. If you burn down their establishment, you're only going to make them angrier. And because we've seen that happen right here on this campus in the case of destruction of laboratory equipment because by PETA, animal groups like that. So whether Monsieur Bové is completely nonviolent or not is in the lap of the gods to discuss that one. But he's a very key player in anti-globalism as we know and love it today. And he got his start in that movement. He got his encouragement from that movement. Another very important little item. It's not, I mean, the item is little, but the importance is great. The Larzac campaign introduced the word nonviolence into French vocabulary. They had practically not discussed it before. I'm not saying that in every café on Rue des Langres people say la non-violence, n'est-ce pas? But at least it introduced the term into the discourse, and think what an incredible difference that could make. As the philosopher Nietzsche said, die richtigen Originalen sind die Namengeber. The real original types are the ones who coin words for things, name givers, nomenclatures. That sometimes is not true, but sometimes it's true because how can you talk about something if you don't know what to call it? Or how can you talk about it sensibly if you're calling it by the wrong word, like free trade? So that's two very important things. And then in August of 2003, there was a tremendous meeting, 8th, 9th, and 10th of August in Larzac. So it's now about 20 years since the Larzac peasants, 103 of them, stood forward and refused to accept the extension of the camp. They led to more than 50,000 of them permanent members and so forth. This rolled over, I'm reading your announcement about that meeting, that celebratory meeting, not only to commemorate in nostalgia this anniversary, but to carry out a vital struggle against the marchandisation, the commercialization, mercantilization, turning everything. What do we call it when we turn something into commoditization? Isn't it? Commodification, thank you. Merci, Marcel. But to carry forward this vital combat against the commodification of the planet. So, Amy? This was 2003, August. So this campaign had a very big continuation into the future. So it worked, quote unquote, and it worked no quotes, and it pretty much went from start to finish without, as far as I know, a single act of even property destruction, unless you call eating some of the grass around the Eiffel Tower by sheep property destruction, but somehow that one doesn't bother me. So this was one of the direct communications or transmissions of Gandhiism into our modern world. Last semester we discussed how intense was the transmission from the freedom struggle in India to the civil rights movement. Here you see it going into areas where Gandhi did not explicitly commit himself. He didn't say, I'm against globalism, for a very simple reason. They didn't have the word yet. They didn't know that was what was happening. Now, with your permission, because David's going to be here any moment, I want to start talking about the institution that's being built. And we've already discussed a general framework where we said that third-party nonviolent intervention, David, and civilian-based defense are the two basic forms of using nonviolence against militarism today. It's good to be up here on the platform. It's the first time I'm taller than you. Where's your car?
Down. Hello.
Okay. Amy? Yeah. Give me, you take your breath for a couple minutes, David, and give me a little introduction. Okay. So as I see it, this operation, third-party nonviolent intervention, itself has two basic sources. One is in human rights work, where human rights people have decided that they can intervene in a country where human rights are being violated to a certain level. You know, we're not going to invade Canada because their parking restrictions are too severe, but there comes a point where you feel that human dignity has been violated, and all human beings are involved in this. And so you have what the French call a droit d'ingérence, or the right or actual obligation to involve yourself, to intervene. So that's something that's come up slowly in human rights work, and you'll still see a lot of human rights rhetoric in the third-party nonviolent intervention movement. And the other thing that fed into the stream is Gandhi's invention of the Shanti Sena, or the Army of Peace. Now, his original conception was that you would have people living in a community, may or may not be from the district, and in times of peace they would furnish good offices to the community just to be there. We discussed the way Hamas and Hezbollah and other groups that have a armed agenda, they do a lot of alternative institution building and social service work that the regime isn't doing. So in their case, it's very much a mixture of good and bad. Our guys, Shanti Sainiks, would be very much nonviolent, and so they would be there in the community, they'd get the trust of the community, and when ethnic tensions flared up, as unfortunately has been the story repeatedly in India since Gandhi's time, they would interpose themselves in various ways, including, well, I'm going to let David say exactly what nonviolent interveners do today, but as fasting is to protest, interposition is to nonviolent intervention. In other words, as a last resort, if all else has failed and open conflict is happening, you will actually interpose yourself between the two parties. Now, that may seem like a very dangerous thing to do, and we're not saying it's not a dangerous thing to do, but at the same time, crossing the street is a dangerous thing to do. Not doing anything about violence is an extremely dangerous thing to do. And the fact of the matter is that the track record of people doing this has actually been rather good. With the exception of 3 people in the Middle East recently, and arguably they were doing something slightly different, basically no one has been killed doing third-party nonviolent intervention. I was on this campus in the 1970s where there was a big protest against the ROTC. I get nostalgic sometimes thinking about the old days. And in those days, the ROTC was still called the ROTC. After years of work, we got them to change their name. It was tremendous progress, just like the School of the Americas watch. Anyway, they were in a little building called Callahan Hall, and one day a group of very angry students descended on Callahan Hall. They're picking up rocks. They were going to stone Callahan Hall. It was not a good idea because inside of Callahan Hall there were these racks of rifles. I'd seen them when I went in to put up a poster about my nonviolence course. That was a lot of fun, but we'll talk about that some other time. There were racks and racks of rifles, and all these military affairs students been trained how to use them. So you have all this heavy equipment inside the building and all this stones and anger coming down. And suddenly a little group which existed for 1 month, I think, called Berkeley Students for Peace. They showed up. I don't know how, in those days they didn't have cell phones or anything. I don't know how they knew to be there. But they showed up and they just stood in between these two groups and said, if you throw stones, you'll hit us. So the people with the stones lost heart and they went back because they didn't want to hit their fellow students. They wanted to hit ROTC people who were also their fellow students. That's the logic of violence. But in this little miniature episode, you see what nonviolent intervention can do at this extreme verge of interposition. So in 1980, on Grindstone Island in Canada, a group formed itself called Peace Brigades International that decided to take volunteers, give them some training, and do this kind of work wherever there are conflicts all over the world. They had some spectacular successes. It's unbelievable what a small group of people can do. They show up voluntarily risking their lives for the sake of peace, not for one party or against the other. That's the magic formula here. Peace Brigades International, a very venerable, very honored institution, has more or less specialized in what they call protective accompaniment, which puts them back in the human rights area. That means if a person is under death threat, they can call PBI, or the organization can call PBI, send people into the country, and they will accompany that person 24/7. Go to work with them, go home with them, and it can be spectacularly successful. In Guatemala in the early 80s, when the only human rights organization was being selectively assassinated, PBI went in with like 5 or 6 people to accompany the leaders, and the minute they arrived on the scene, those assassinations stopped. The group was able to continue working, and they used one of their terms. PBI talks about creating a space for peace. They don't get involved. They don't get involved in policy. They just create the space so the people on the ground can have a discussion rather than a power struggle. But in 1999, David, correct me if I'm wrong, you went to the Hague Conference for Peace in The Hague. Sorry, that's a stupid joke. And there you were heard giving a passionate, fiery speech, which I hope you're going to do here again today. Seems to be about the only kind you do, by a man named Mel Duncan, who had this notion independently of taking this concept and building it into a worldwide force. And between 1999 and the present, it's absolutely incredible what these guys and a number of others and about 90 global organizations who've joined them have been able to accomplish. So I would like David to tell us about the group and to report on his recent trip to Sri Lanka, which was our pilot project. Our conflict is extremely intense, as you know, and where we've been for just about 3 years? Just 3.5 years now. Okay, good. So, David Hartzell.
Well, glad to be here, and you're lucky to be in a class on nonviolence with Professor Nagler. I mean, I wish every young person in the world had a chance to take a class on nonviolence. We might have a much less warlike world. Well, I'd like to just share with you a little bit about my own background and what we're trying to do with the Nonviolent Peace Force, and then have time for your questions and discussion. My father had the good sense to take my brother and me to Montgomery, Alabama during the Montgomery bus boycott back in 1956. I was just 15 years old at the time. And I'm sure you know from your reading, the Montgomery bus boycott was kind of the beginning of the reactivization of the civil rights movement in this country. And when we went there, tens of thousands of people were walking every day to work, rather than ride the buses in an apartheid system. And several of the churches had been bombed. Martin Luther King's home had been shot at. I visited one cross where all that was left was the pews were in splinters, and there was a piece of the cross up in the front. And these people were saying, rather than hate these folks, they're doing this to us. We're going to try to love